how I see it. And I think that religions are like these sources of ancient wisdom, and parts of them are going to be wrong because humans are fallible, and it's we can always make progress by course correcting. But if you throw out the whole thing, you kind of you don't arrive at a better solution, because it takes time to figure out what the good solutions are.
I'm Christina Hudson Kohler, an egg processing manager living in Syracuse, New York, and you are listening to the Vance Crowe Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we explore something that is deeply important to me, the education of children. I have on today a man named Chrisman Frank, who has started up a program called the Synthesis School, where they bring together children to be able to do a different sort of problem solving that helps them think about education and grow in what they know and what they're curious about in very interesting ways. I met Chrisman through the world of Twitter. I saw him interacting with people that you may remember, Ana Lorena Fabrega, talking about this school. And I have to say, many of the things I expected Chrisman to say, he didn't say. And his take on education throughout this entire conversation is novel and will challenge you and will give you some new ways to think about, hey, how does this apply to me? Is this something that I want for my kids? I really enjoyed this conversation with Chrisman, and I'm sure we will have him on again for future podcasts. Right now, most of my time when I'm not doing interviews is spent doing legacy interviews, which is where I interview loved ones of people to discover what is their life story, to have them tell about their childhood, about their career, about why they chose who they married, and what their role as a parent was. And then we always finish off with them describing their legacy and the things that they want to leave behind. This has become a great service, one that has grown and grown, and now I'm doing mostly full time. And so if you're interested in having me interview a loved one so that you can preserve it on video to share with the family or to leave something behind, you can go to store.articulate.ventures and click on the link for legacy interviews. We are working on moving into a new studio, but we also do them over Zoom. So if your loved one has a little trouble getting around, we would love to be able to interview them. We can do it just the same way we do these podcast interviews. All right, without further ado, we're going to head to this interview with Chrisman Frank. Chrisman Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, I think education is always on the minds of people that have kids, right? How am I going to get them ready for the world that's around them? I think particularly in today's day and age, education is at the very top of people's minds, in between COVID restrictions and people realizing what's going on with public education, and then with just some of the things that are being taught in schools that I think frighten a lot of parents. So I'm excited to have you on to talk about your program that goes by Synthesis School. So maybe the best place to start is, what is Synthesis and how are you involved with it?
Yeah. So, I mean, to your point about, education being on a lot of people's minds today, I think, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there's this like breakdown of institutional trust, and there's sort of like this realization that maybe the people who are teaching the kids and setting the curriculum don't have the same values as the parents, right? And in many cases, the not so much the teachers, or the people like running the system they're just explicit about that. Like, parents shouldn't get a say in what the kids learn. Like, we're the experts. So I think that's where like a lot of this, a lot of the kind of heat comes from in that regard. So Synthesis, we got our start actually. Elon Musk was kind of in the same position as a lot of parents. I mean, this was like 7 or 8 years ago, but his kids were going to, really fancy private school, and he just realized the school was not doing the things that he wanted to do. And so he hired my co-founder, Josh, who was a teacher at the school, and said like, hey, let's start from first principles and just think like, how do we build, an education for our kids that teaches them to solve problems, because the world's got lots of problems. If we want to move technology and science forward and just build a better world and have more progress, we need kids who can solve problems. And it's not clear that is even the goal of the current system. And if it is the goal, they're not achieving it very well. And so Josh went there, and he went to SpaceX and started a school for Elon's kids and a handful of other families at SpaceX. And he developed this really cool problem solving class called synthesis, which is sort of, this is where the company gets our name. It's the kids, they solve problems in the form of team games. So it's sort of like a team sport for problem solving. And I went down to SpaceX and saw this about 7 years ago. And I saw the kids engage with it. They were, they're like 12 years old, shouting these really complex sounding arguments at each other. And I was just blown away by both by how engaged they were and by the sophistication of their conversations. And I was just like, wow, this is the future of education. And I was really excited about that. And then as soon as that kind of high wore off, my stomach kind of sank because I had a 2-year-old at the time. And I was just like, I'm never going to be able to get him this kind of education. And, that just made my stomach sink. Like I wanted the best for him. And, I just kind of seen the promised land and then had it taken away. Cause like, I'm not an engineer at SpaceX. I couldn't get my kid in that school. And so I tried to convince Josh to start a school in the Bay Area where I was living at the time, so my kids could join it. And he was just like not really interested in that, and kind of had his hands full working for Elon. But fast forward, 5 years, Josh and I become good friends and kept talking about education, kind of how things should be, and kind of talked about doing something together in the future. And then COVID hit in 2020, and people kind of started looking at education, kind of looking at different options outside the system. They're forced to because of COVID shutting the schools down. And at that same time, Elon's kids finished with Ad Astra, which was the SpaceX school, and so Josh was kind of free to do his own thing, be a free agent. And so we started this company, which basically takes that class from Ad Astra, which is, only available to a handful of families, and was the most innovative part of the most innovative school. And we're trying to make that available to everyone. So that's the company in a nutshell.
So when I was approaching you about this, because I know I've had Anna Lorena Fabrega on, and I know she's been a very strong proponent of synthesis school. I was under the impression that what you were doing was several hours a day, maybe 4 or 5 online, but now it's sounding like this is the synthesis part of the school is not all day, every day online. Can you tell me a little bit more about just like, how does it work in practice?
Yeah. So it's primarily most people are doing just an hour a week right now. So it's kind of like that one sort of class period. And we just started there because it's, strategically as a company, there are a lot of people that get into education and they do something like they start a school, and you kind of try to do all the pieces of it at once. And what Josh and I talked about this a lot. But what they had at Ad Astra, like a lot of it was like kind of normal stuff. Like they were doing normal math, but they were just doing it faster. They're doing biology, but they're just doing it faster than like normal places. But it was like kind of the standard system. But there was synthesis, and it primarily is like this totally different thing that's like, it's just hard to get anywhere else. And so our strategy has been like, get that to as many people as we can. Let's build this up and scale that out. And by doing that, we're attracting the kind of students we want to build a network. So the people who are most likely to advance science and technology in the future and solve complex problems and move humanity forward, we're building a network of these kids. And we'll start adding more classes and more experiences until eventually you can get 4 or 5 hours a day on synthesis. But I don't actually think I don't know how necessary that is in our age range, like 8 to 14. I think my son's in synthesis and he does like 2 hours a week. I would like to ramp it up to like 90 minutes, 2 hours a day, something like that. He's 8. And I think that's enough like intensity and rigorous learning time. And then the rest of the time we have them like outside in the woods or going to the beach or just being a kid and like playing, right? So there's this intense like learning how to think and solve problems. And it is very intense. It's like exhausting. You can't do it all day. And then the rest of the time, go read books or be a kid.
Well, I got to say, this is actually a big plus for me. I remember when I was looking at what you guys were doing and thinking about it being a large model of being online, I was like, it doesn't really matter how cool it is. I don't want my children online all the time. And I'm very interested in this. I have a daughter that's not quite 2 yet, but just in the same position where you're already beginning to understand, hey, there's some education that has to be done outside of the house on some level, right? They there's just things either I don't have time to do or that other people probably have a capacity that I don't. So
Yeah.
when you talk about synthesis school or that hour that they're spending, can you describe what that's like?
Yeah, a little bit. Some of it's kind of secretive, so the kids don't know exactly what to expect, which is part of the fun. But they'll learn basically if they sign up and they'll start in foundation, which is kind of like getting the basics of synthesis. It's a 3-month program. You get the basics and you figure out if this is something for you and you want to continue in. You'll be in a class with 15 to 18 other students, and then you're just going to be thrown into. We'll put you in the like Zoom breakout rooms, so groups of like 3 or 4, and you'll get a problem that's basically looks like a video game, and you'll just be told like, okay, figure it out, and then all the kids will be like what? Like what do you? They're waiting for instructions, and we're just like, there's no instructions. Like you figure out how to play the game and how to win. And so we'll leave them for like 10 minutes trying to figure out the situation, and then the game will end, and they'll have scores, and then we'll kind of bring everybody together and then be like, okay, what did you learn? Like, what did you figure out? And then again, they'll kind of start off, if they're in normal school, like kind of shy about that, and not know what to say and not want to give the wrong answer, but eventually they get kind of drawn into it and start throwing out some conjectures and some ideas and criticizing each other's ideas, and then so we'll do that reflection period, and then we'll go back and play again and see what we learn. So they're doing the scientific method effectively. Just give them these problems to figure out, and then once they figure it out, you give them a harder one. And there's always this competitive, collaborative element to it, kind of like a team sport, which adds another degree of complexity to the experience, right? It's not enough to just figure out how the world works. You have to be able to communicate that and work with other people and make, collaborative decisions.
Yeah, it's funny. There's like an emphasis on cooperation and teamwork among kids in school. But what you don't really understand until you get out into the real world is group projects do have a hierarchy. There is almost no, when you're in a corporation, if you're working on something, if somebody doesn't hand in their work, that becomes very apparent very quickly. Whereas when you're in school and group work, there's some level of complete openness that competition isn't there. It's like an artificial environment that feels really artificial.
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting. Josh kind of dealt with that when he was coming up with. Do you have a fly there or something? Josh dealt with that when he was coming up with the idea for synthesis. He was giving kids these questions. Because he was meeting with Elon like every month or so while he's running the school, and kind of he'd go to Elon's house, and Elon would be on the phone talking with people from his various companies, and Josh kind of like listen in on this and kind of just listen how he thinks and how he solves problems. And then he'd give the problems to the kids. So he'd be like, hey, everybody, how would you move SpaceX from LA to Brownsville, Texas? Like, how would you approach that? It's a whole company that makes rockets. How are you going to move that? And the kids really they engage with that. They like those kind of questions, as it's quite complex, and there's a lot to think through. And but at the end of it, they would do like a report, and then Josh would be like, okay, like cool, they didn't give grades, but it's like you get an A or you get a B, and it's very inert. And he realized there was something cool about having the kids solve problems, these open-ended problems, but if it's just to like please the teacher, then it doesn't feel real. And so that's when he added the element of like the competition to it. And then it really clicked. Like the kids are really, really excited about it because it's real. There are stakes now, and they're objective, right? Like it's, you deal with an actual reality in a game, not just like, did you fit it into the teacher's mind of like what they're looking for? Like, there's like an objective judge there, which just, adds a completely different element and makes it way more engaging.
And so from the synthesis side of it, you guys have actual teachers that check in on those 4 students that are working. How does the teacher-student relationship work?
Yeah, we usually have 2. We'll have like a teacher who's like someone who's not always like a trained teacher, but just someone who's older and has like more life experience and more gravitas. And then we'll have like a TA who's usually younger, like a college student or someone straight out of college. And they're floating around to the different rooms and kind of checking in on the kids and asking questions, and then they're leading the Socratic discussion after the kids play the games. And then usually about once a month, they're meeting with the students one-on-one or in small groups to give like more direct like feedback and coaching, or they're sending videos to home to the parents and to the kids on specific feedback and like course corrections.
So, what's your background in raising kids or teaching kids? I mean, you had said, yeah. I mean, like, so you have like you have a 7-year-old, you said, or an 8-year-old?
8-year-old now, yeah, just turned 8. 8-year-old, an almost 6-year-old, be 6 in June, and then an almost 3-year-old, yeah, also turns 3 in June. So 2 boys, older ones, and then a young girl.
And then teaching background?
No, I was never a classroom teacher. I was when I moved to the Bay Area, I was kind of looking for a job, a way to make money, and I started tutoring. So I became a math tutor, and I ended up starting a little tutoring company that I ran for a few years. Just coming from like a small town, had no idea that you could make money like that. But I was kind of tutoring like the wealthy like Silicon Valley people's kids in math, and it was a fine gig, and then expanded it to be like a little company. So got the kind of like it opened my eyes, to just how poorly the instruction is done in the system, and just how poorly things are presented, and just stoked the fire for me to like try and make things better. So yeah, I did that. I did that for a while. I started a company that then we got into a program called Imagine K-12, which is now it's been folded into Y Combinator, which is the startup, world's most famous startup accelerator. So we got in there and quickly like just realized that the tutoring business was like not going to reach the kind of scale to impact the world that like those guys were looking for. And just being part of that made me really, really open my eyes to like a much bigger world, because you had like Paul Graham, who'd founded Y Combinator, come in to speak. You had the CEO of LinkedIn came to chat with us, and all these other founders who built things that were being used by millions of people. And it was just like, it was the first time I'd really thought like, wow, like I could do something that reached that number of people and had that kind of impact. So our company was the tutoring company was not going to scale that fast, but some of our classmates in that program had started a company called Class Dojo, which is like a messaging service for people who in school. The teachers can message the parents and talk about the kids and just stay in closer touch. And so I ended up joining there. It was a couple thousand users at the time. Now it's like 50 million. So I spent like 7 years there scaling that up and kind of learning the tech industry. And again, just going around and like visiting different schools and kind of learning about like the industry and like the state of education everywhere from like, really fancy private schools to public schools in rural areas. So kind of got like a good bird's eye view doing that. And part of that was I went down to meet Josh at SpaceX, which kicked off this the synthesis adventure as well. So been in it for a while, kind of know my way around the idea mazes in education. And yeah.
So outside of the synthesis school, how are you educating your children?
Yeah, I have a tweet thread about this. We basically they're with like a not exactly like a tutor, like a mother's helper now. So all 3 of them, we'll just have a couple hours in the morning where I think they're like building Marble Run right now. I just went out there and checked that out. So 2 of them are building like a Marble Run, and then the other one is working on like a typing game. The 8-year-old's like learning how to type. So we do that for 2 days a week. The other 3 days a week, they go to like a homeschool charter in our area. So that's like it's free because you use like government funds to do it. But there's no pretense to doing anything academic in the school. So they just go and they play with other kids, and they'll like they built a bridge, like a Da Vinci bridge the other day. They put on school plays. They do this 3 days a week for like 4 or 5 hours each morning. And it's just social development. It's the concept here I think of is like we bundle together education, which is learning how to think in terms of concepts, right? To understand like deep concepts that apply across situations in the world. Well, we bundle that with child development, which is like a different thing, right? They're really completely different. There's no reason to bundle them. And I think with the internet, that cognitive development and education, that stuff is going to be done way better by the internet. And then you can do child development. You can break these two things apart. And so that's how we approach it. The kids, they're like outside, they're in the forest, or they're going to the beach, or they're just playing with other kids, and we're not thinking about education like for most of their waking hours. But then we have them. They read a lot of books. We play chess. We do things like synthesis to make them smarter, and we just kind of separate those two things. And I will say since COVID and since starting the company, I've gotten to know a lot of like high profile, individuals and families. And I find that is basically the norm. That's kind of what, everybody at least is talking to me is doing. And there's some selection bias there. But I think the people anyone who has the means is kind of trying to do that same thing. Like, got to have our kids have social development and a community and get around other people. But I don't trust like the local option to teach them to be smarter. One of our engineers said this the other day. He's like, if you go local, you get like local class education, or like maybe at best like regional class. And then you go on the internet, you can get world class. And so, anyway, that's how I approach it. That's how I think about it.
I'm in total agreement about the child development. And in fact, when I was first starting the adventure of trying to figure out where will we send Violet to school, you start looking at the standard alternative, right, which is Montessori. Right. And some kind of program like that. And there's a lot of benefits to it. But one of the things I didn't know about Montessori until I dug a lot deeper into it is how rigorously structured things are. I mean, like the kids are put into a pattern and they have freedom within that pattern, but it is still a very rigorous system. And so when I encountered something like the Waldorf school, where they treat the child development, I mean, the first 7 or 8 years when you're in the education program, they don't even go inside. They are outside at all times, playing in sand or mud or with trees or whatever that is. And that really, really speaks to me. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I'm really afraid of getting all the way to 7 or 8 years old and then having them wake up and be like, oh, there's some fundamental concepts that would have been a lot easier for you to have picked up on while you were being educated that you didn't pick up because you were treating the child, the development side of it, this kind of dreamlike time, as something that would go on forever. So I feel this tension that you're describing. And I think the education that you're describing in my circles are largely the ones that people want, but are incredibly difficult to put together because you have to put them together yourself in addition to doing whatever you're doing for work and other living.
Yeah, it's hard. And that's kind of like our aim is just to be we like, I think we'll build into like a one-stop shop, whether we partner with other people or whatever. But I think people are kind of looking for someone that they can trust, who has similar values and who's thought deeply about this. And I think, having to piece it all together, like we're kind of in that, phase with our kids now, and it's difficult. And we would love if we just had someone we can trust to kind of turn that over and can think through this stuff for us. I will say, how old's your daughter Violet? Did you say?
She's 2.
She's 2.
Almost
okay.
2.
That's a cute name. I like that name. I mean, I think one point to make is like even the Spartans did not enter the agoge, like the training, until they were 7, and the Spartans are like pretty hardcore, right? So you think if they could have gotten more done something more hardcore, like by pushing it younger, they would have done it. So there is something like it's not that beneficial to accelerate learning, there is like just developmental stages. Like I'm finding this with my son, but somewhere between like 7 and 8, he developed the ability to think conceptually. Like there's just this massive leap in conceptual ability. And so there's not that much point in talking about abstract things before he was that age. There's just like developmental milestones. However, I don't totally agree with the Waldorf approach, because I think you can sort of imprint reading and math, like arithmetic and number sense. I think you can do those things, and I think it's kind of important to do those things. I think most likely kind of changes how your brain develops, and you can start doing those things that, we waited until about 5 to start doing that. So that's kind of how I would approach it as your kids grow up. Like by far the most important thing, like get outside, like be a kid. Social development by age 4 is critically important. So that's kind of like all you should think about, providing a stable home environment. If you're a dad, you got to chase them around the house and be the monster. Like that's super important. But you don't have to worry about the academic stuff until later.
Yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate in that we have an area behind our house that has got a creek. There's all kinds of flowering trees, and we've started planting fruit trees. And one of the things that's the most amazing to me about Violet is the number of trees she can name and the number of things that she can pair together. I mean, even before she can speak words, I can hand her a pine cone and she can tell me which of the trees it came from, or we can go pick flowers and she knows exactly where they came from in a large area. And if I had been sitting there in the house trying to do that with flashcards, I'm sure she'd have some rote memorization, but it is so much more sophisticated because the models are all just slightly different. So it's not like her doing a one-to-one memorization.
Yeah, and I think you learn. My kids did a forest preschool in the city in San Francisco, and they'd go around and just explore all day, and like they'd turn over a log, and then they'd talk about like why is the log rotted on the other side, and what are the bugs doing there, and what are these bugs, and they learn to name things and all that, and I think that to me this is what we should strive for as a society is to let every kid have that kind of experience. I think it's good for the soul. I think it changes, who they are as people. It's like child development. It doesn't matter. She'll forget all the trees. Our kids will forget all the names of everything, but it doesn't matter. It gives you this like sense that you can, go out and explore and understand things, and like, the world is a good place. And I think that's if I could snap my fingers, I would try to give that experience to as many kids as possible.
Well, there's an interesting tension about being in the city and being able to do this in mass. There are a lot of my audience are feedlot operators for the cattle system, right? And they talk about, in a lot of ways, apartments or series of apartments or CAFOs, and it is really difficult to take human beings that are packed in, that do everything through tubes, where the experience of nature is always contained within a block of sidewalks, to be able to get them to have that feeling. And I wonder if some of the internal chaos that we feel now is that we have taken cities way beyond the scale that they've ever been before. And now, how does the human mind adapt to that? And it's kind of an interesting experience we're in right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had like a really great experience in San Francisco because we live near Golden Gate Park, and just Golden Gate Park is like a marvel of the world as far as I'm concerned. It was like sand dunes, and then they just built it up, planted all these different trees and flowers, and it's totally beautiful. It's massive. And I think it's like a good like model for development. I don't know what it would be like in New York, where there's like way fewer parks, but we at least felt like we could get somewhat out into nature, which is a cool thing about San Francisco. You've got like the density and the museums and all that, and then you felt like you could get at least some semblance of nature, or at least like a large garden at least.
Well, one of the interesting things about San Francisco, so I used to live in Mendocino, and I actually got to meet their lead arborist. And I think that when San Francisco was developing as a city, they deeply thought about having that integration between trees and parks and the city in a way that people now, whatever it was, 50, 70, 100 years later, are being able to benefit from. Whereas in New York, it just didn't happen that way. And if you want to have a little area of grass, and same thing, I guess, in San Francisco, but that's a multi-million-dollar piece of grass, and it just it definitely separates people from whatever it was that they were spending their time, however they were spending their time before as children. It's definitely a different experience in the last 100, 150 years.
Yeah. There's less. It's like I've heard this term, like there seems to be less unowned space. Like when I was a kid in a small town, there were just like, there'd be empty lots and stuff where you'd go to play. And it's now going back, it's like everything's been built out. Like you wouldn't get that sort of experience of going to like play in the woods or play in like the empty lot or whatever. Like everything's kind of spoken for now, which is, different different way to grow up.
So to people living in the countryside, to hear somebody say, I'm living in California is like a foreign concept to them. What makes you decide that California is the place you want to be?
It's I rode my bicycle across the country after college, and that was really it. And I was just like, I'll try to ride my bicycle across the country. That was like my post college adventure, and then when I got here, I was surprised. San Francisco is so cold. A lot of people don't know that it's just kind of cold year round. Not cold, but it's like 60 degrees and like windy and foggy a lot of the time. So I went down to San Diego, lived there for a while, learned to surf. Spent a couple years kind of working but spending a lot of time like learning to surf and having fun there, and then moved up to the Bay Area. So I don't know. California is just the ocean and the scale of like the mountains and everything. It was just so different from growing up in Virginia. And at the time, it was like a really in the Bay Area, it was this really interesting, eclectic kind of population that was really open to ideas, which is something that really was inspiring and like exciting to be around. It's kind of become, the environment there has become more stultifying in the last 10 years or so. But at the time, it was this really exciting, like the Wild West kind of feeling.
I had that exact same feeling. And the idea that you could, I learned to surf when I was up in Mendocino, the idea that you could touch the electricity of the globe, right? That's the way surfing felt for me. And there was just nothing like that in central Illinois.
Yeah.
And like, I also agree that it's funny in so many ways, California puts itself as being progressive, but now it seems like they've frozen in some way, right? Like their progression is much more conservatism, and it's kind of a flipping on the head of like there's very little desire for change, or if that change comes, it has to be only within a certain paradigm.
Yeah, it's very strange. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. It's not exactly conservative. It's more like it's just like a wishful thinking. I guess I would say wishful thinking and kind of like a mob/herd mentality. So you have kind of like a complete, if you think of like the ideal of like a liberal or progressive, it's someone who's like open to new ideas and questioning things. And I would say in that sense, it's like there's a handful of things that you're allowed to be open to and to question, and then everything else is kind of off limits. So it's it's gotten a little bit weird. Glad to be out of
What
there.
What is the world that you're expecting you're going to send your children out into by the time they hit 18 or 21? As you're preparing them with education, you have to have in mind something that you think the world is going to look like. What are you expecting?
Yeah, no, I don't know. It's hard. I think computers and information technology and networks are going to continue to be an important facet of the world. I mean, this is sort of like predicting the continued rise of cities, at the dawn of the 20th century, or the continued kind of proliferation of industrial technology in the 20th century. Like I think information technology is going to continue to be important. I also think a lot about, I had to move to the Bay Area to get the internet was not as developed, 10 years ago. So you found like a high density of kind of lateral thinkers in the Bay Area that you couldn't find easily. And when I moved out, I was worried about getting disconnected from that. But I just found that my intellectual community was kind of on Twitter anyway. And so it didn't matter so much. Now I live in kind of like a small town, just off the coast. And I still feel like intellectually connected, and there's some kind of, I get that, which I never got growing up in like my small town. But now I can get that living in a small town, but I also have like more space and like nature and things like that. So I expect my kids will probably do some kind of like information, like knowledge work, something like that. They're going to be, the information environment, I think, is just going to continue to, we're not going to go back to where you have so much less data and information in jobs. Like we're all going to have to be kind of centaurs and like partner with computers and learn to think with computers and lots of data and information. Like I expect that to continue. Other than that, I think it's kind of hard to say. I think that's kind of the fun of it. So that's why I want my kids to be able to get out into nature, and if they become farmers, like great. I always think like become farmers or become like scientists and technologists, or maybe become both. But like I don't want them to do anything in between, like work in like a large bureaucracy or something like that. I think it's like work on the ends of the barbell.
If you talk about cities and their growth and kind of the concept of this infinite growth, the Stuart Brands or the Joffrey Wests of the world, do you think that we'll continue the migration from rural areas into cities? Like right now, it was about 5 years ago that 50% of the population now lives in cities. Do you think that will just continue until basically everyone's living in a city?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know about that. I think in some sense, yes. And I think also with the rise of remote work and with what I mentioned about, there's a couple things in cities where you've got an advantage. Like there's in San Francisco, there's a bakery that was selling like, $7 avocado toast. And like, if you're into that, you're really into avocado toast, and there's a place that, that sells that, and it's really great. And there's all these kind of different sort of bakeries and coffee shops and restaurants and all that kind of thing. That's like a draw for the city, and it's a draw for young people as well, because there's like better mating opportunities. There's a more liquid market for like mating opportunities in the city. So I think in that sense, there's always these advantages for cities. But then you have this counterbalancing force, which is like the intellectual environment of the cities, like the coffee shops and that sort of thing, where you'd go maybe like hang out and talk to people and exchange ideas. Now that's the internet is like a better place for that. So that's kind of a counterbalancing force where people can move out of the cities. So as far as how that plays out, like I don't really know. I expect to see some online communities turn into offline communities. So I expect there will be people who like buy a plot of land and move there with a bunch of, a handful of friends, and like start a new village or city or something like that, where they can have more land and open space, and then use kind of the internet to stay connected to the pulse of things. But beyond that, the cities grow or fail. Like, I have no idea.
When you think about those like taking online communities and moving to offline, whether it's stuff like Game B that people are talking about, that
What is
let's
Game
try
B?
and oh, you've not heard of Game B? So Game B is Jim Rutt is a guy that actually took a group of people and said, hey, if we wanted to have an alternative to the Game A world, which is the rat race, the climb up the bureaucratic ladder until you get to a point where you make enough money that you can jump out and retire. What if we were to create a different game that would allow for there to be communities?
Right.
And I think one of the things that's really difficult about starting your own community is that there are certain aspects of human nature that can't be overcome. So if you've ever talked to anybody that's joined a cult, right, where the cult gets to a certain size, and unless you have these really hard and fast rules and people have some values that allow them to transcend it, you have people cheating on one another, you have people, and sexual changes are really big. That's one of the reasons cults break down the fast.
Yeah.
But you also have things
we have a stable arrangement, like the mating and like sexuality is like you never maybe get this perfect, but people who like want to throw out all the rules, it's like, well, like people are always trying that, and it always
it always fails because the things horror. Yeah, you're hitting this red line. And it was funny. There's a young guy, Arjun Kamani, who actually I was talking with on Twitter today, and he had a very interesting blog post that I think is worth mentioning, which was that he said there's an irrationality that goes along with faith that like we just don't accept, right? So if you're a logical, rational person and you say, well, how do we know that this happened or this is the right way to do things? Well, it's because God said so, right? Like we don't accept that. And so, but it's that irrationality. It is that belief in some higher thing that allows you to be able to form people into these groups, to be able to do some kind of a commune. But it's funny because the people that are so longing for these types of groups are often highly rational people that are trying to resolve the conflicts of society using engineering or trying to create a game B. It's a
Yeah.
weird tension that I think is worth exploring, that you almost need religion or at least some higher faith in order to be able to transcend human nature to make these communities work.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I don't think religion is irrational. It's a rationality that includes time. All right. So ideas that are in religions that are successful, they at least these ideas didn't get all the people killed. Right. And so there's some rationality in time where you might rationally think in your head like, well, we should, we can live in a cult and have like total sexual freedom, but you're not going to be the first person to think of that. And the fact that that's not the primary mode of human living, like a rational person could think like, well, why isn't that? Maybe there's something I'm missing. So I think rationality can include the idea that there are things that you might be missing. That's at least how I see it. And I think that religions are like these sources of ancient wisdom, and parts of them are going to be wrong because humans are fallible, and it's we can always make progress by course correcting. But if you throw out the whole thing, you kind of you don't arrive at a better solution because it takes time to figure out what the good solutions are.
Yeah, in genetics, there's this concept called linkage drag. So let's say you're breeding for tomatoes and you want to be able to get a stronger peel in it. So you breed for getting the stronger peel and you accidentally bring some features in that you maybe didn't want. Maybe the seeds got thicker,
Right.
or created some kind of waxy thing on the leaves that made it grow less good. I think that religion suffers from linkage drag, and the ones that really transcend time are able to cut those things off, right? But if you're an outside observer approaching it and you're like, wait, why are we doing the Passover feast? We're saying the same thing that we did last year. Everybody already knows what this is supposed to be saying and what this is all about, but it's the act of doing it that is actually the valuable thing. And the linkage drag of some other weird belief that's incorporated into that is something that makes it probably appear irrational. I like your concept that rationality becomes clearer if you add in time in a way that doesn't when you're just looking at how does that look right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think too, what you're seeing kind of with kind of the progressive sort of craziness, so San Francisco is probably the best example where you have some kind of like, kind of some nutty people in charge of things. It's just you can't change too fast. Like we all of us, my friend Joe Norman and colleague at Synthesis now, a complexity scientist, wrote an essay about this, saying all of us are conservative progressives. Like that, we recognize there are good things about life that we want to conserve, and then there are things that we can improve on and that we want to make progress on. And you can't go too far in either direction. It's just kind of like in the computer science lingo, it's like an NP hard problem. Like there's no computable solution. We just kind of have to try things out and figure it out. So this is why humans are probably always going to fight, because there's just no clear answers to these things. Some things you just have to try to figure out if they work or not. And that's
yeah. And we kind of live in a world where it's very difficult to even understand how close we are to what is normal. Like that concept of This Is Water by David Foster Wallace, right? Where you're living in this world and you've always lived in this world. So you don't understand that this is actually a relatively new invention. One of the things that happened when I lived in Africa was that, one, it stays light a lot longer. So it's like 8:30, and it's always 8:30 that the sun went down. But then you don't realize that most people don't have lights on at night. So you actually get tired at night. Whereas like if you've lived your entire life where there's always been light bulbs, you just expect that it's the natural state that I kind of feel awake at 10, I can get a lot of work done. But once it's so difficult to know what those things are, that because they're so ubiquitous in our worlds. Yeah.
And it's difficult to decide. I like this game B idea because it's sort of just interesting for me to think about people kind of opting out of the whole thing, and just because I think there's some yearning that we have for like a past time when everything was perfect that I think Well, maybe that's true. Maybe things used to be better, but I tend to think not. I tend to think things aren't perfect right now, and we can improve them. We can make progress, but I think we in a lot of ways we have made progress from the past, and at least I don't want to go back to being totally like a hunter gatherer or subsistence farmer. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to see people experimenting though.
Matt Ridley always talks about, he wrote the book, The Rational Optimist. Like, if you
Yeah.
don't think things have gotten better, just look at dentistry, right? Like like the hellscape that was your mouth and your teeth before that. The other interesting thing about Game B is it's not a total opt out. So Jim and the people that are around this idea, who I actually think would probably find synthesis school very interesting, talk about this parasitism, like the being a parasite on game A while you get game B going. So it's not this total like, hey, let's just leave our city and go into a commune. It's saying some of us may need to have corporate jobs in order to be able to have some of the access to the systems while we get other things built up. So healthcare being a good example, right? You don't want to just like abscond from the system and have no healthcare if a heart attack comes up. So it wouldn't be a bad idea for somebody to have the regular corporate job that has that insurance while you set
Yeah.
up a much better system.
This is where the normalization of remote work just becomes super interesting, right? Because our company is like totally remote, and they're good, high paying jobs. They pay you enough to live in San Francisco, where the cost of living is extremely high. But like you can live anywhere. Like you could live in some place where cost you $10,000 a year to live or something like that. And so it's if you think in terms of those numbers, one person with a game A job could support 10 or 20 others, or maybe even more if you had if you had kind of infrastructure built around that. So I do expect to see a lot more experimentation there. I don't know, if that's, I don't know how long the time frame or how long that would take to compete with cities, but it's definitely a trend. It seems to me like that idea is in the ether, and people will try it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the necessary but probably not sufficient requirements is in a couple, there was probably a lot of, where one person was like, I want to go out to the countryside and I want to have this rural life. And then after the experience, when I was living in Washington, D.C., I lived in a 480 square foot apartment. Now, luckily, I moved out of there and moved to Missouri where I could get a lot more land for a lot less. But I cannot imagine the psychological change that would have occurred to a person that was living in a 480 square foot apartment, imagining the urban life being the one that they wanted to shoot up the ladder and go. I can't imagine thinking if COVID came around again, they'd stick around for another go round of being locked in such a small place.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it'd be interesting to see how cities bounce back. Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I think as far as I think it's one of the cool things about synthesis is like just you don't have to predict or worry about these things too much. I think the only prediction is that science and technology will continue to be important, and if you want your kids to be able to contribute or have access to those modes of thinking, I think we can do that better than anyone in the world, and I think we can. Um, and we can reach people who live in these game B communities, or like a rural farming community, or a city. Like the goal is to make it so if you're a billionaire or you're like a subsistence farmer, you basically everybody has access to synthesis for their kids. So even if you're a billionaire, you can't buy like a better version of education. At least in the cognitive skills domain for your kids.
What is your pricing model? How does it work for somebody to be able to sign up for synthesis?
Yeah, so right now it's $180 a month, which is just kind of where we just sort of like picked a number, and we the idea is to like lower the prices as we go, as we get more efficient in doing this. We've also just had kind of extraordinary demand, so we've got twice as many people on a reservation who've like done a paid reservation and are on the wait list than we have enrolled right now. So try to we're a very, very small company still. It's the size of like a couple large high schools, like something like that. And so we're trying to get in as many people as we can, and kind of let the wealthier people who can afford it and can take the risk on something new fund the development to make it more effective and more efficient, so we can get it to more people. The ultimate goal, being able to get millions or tens of millions of kids a year in synthesis versus the tiny number that we have right now. So kind of
And
like,
what does the path look like to get to something that big? I mean, that will be, if you have such personalized things where like a human is jumping in there, that's going to take some work.
Yeah, there's a couple. So the Montessori idea of there's a structure. So there's freedom, but there's freedom within a structure. The more structure we can put into the system, then the less training that the people have to have, and so that makes you able to deliver the same or actually like better service in many instances, because you have sort of like going back to that religion idea, like there's a time element where these ideas have been built up over time, similar to that in synthesis, right? Like where we take all these smart humans running these little experiments, with every different class of kids, and then take the best learnings from that and build that into the system and make that the structure that we then get to everybody. And so you can reduce the reliance on, hyper educated, hyper intelligent humans who are scarce and thus super expensive, and put a lot of that into the system. There's another way, which is, if you think about industrial school, I think one of the most sociopathic ideas is the age segregation thing, right? Because if you're like the bottom of the class, you just have the same position in your class the whole time you move through school. So you never get the experience of, if you're the smartest kid, you never get to like be behind or have someone you can look up to who's smarter than you, who you can emulate. And you also, there's not this expectation that you're going to help the people who are younger. So if you're the kid who's like behind, you never get a chance to like teach math because you're always just like struggling yourself and you're behind. There's no one who's younger than you. But that's the way human society has developed, is that you have always somebody who you can look up to and always someone who you're a little bit ahead of. And so I think we can use this in synthesis. We've already started experimenting with it, where the kids who are advanced and who are doing really well can help out the younger kids. And then as part of like their own education, right? So you can have basically the kids helping each other out, because really a 12-year-old's probably like, if they're really, they've been through this system and they're just a little bit ahead, they're probably better at it than a 25-year-old to teach, an 8-year-old, someone who's like a couple years behind them. And anyone who has kids will see this. Like I can get my kid to do anything if we take, his friend who's 2 or 3 years older, and if his friend takes up skateboarding, like he wants to take up skateboarding. If it's, so it's like just a very natural way for humans to learn, and also can probably effectively, much decrease the cost, much more decrease the reliance on hyper intelligent, hyper educated adults who are expensive and are scarce and less expensive.
Man, I think that is a brilliant observation. I think of my own daughter, right, where she's the little one now, and she has an older cousin to her who's just the greatest thing in the whole world.
Yeah.
And that poor kid for many years was the youngest cousin that was picked on and left behind and crying.
Yeah.
But you see him blossom, and he is actually a different kid now that he's the one teaching and being looked up to.
Yeah.
And I had never really thought about the damage that would do on scale. And in fact, most of the people making the rules now are the ones that were at least at the top half of the class that never really experienced that. But it is really important for people to feel both sides.
Yeah, 100%. It's one of the greatest things for synthesis. A lot of the kids we get are kind of super, super gifted, and they'll come in very overconfident, and they'll kind of get smashed in one of the games, and then it'll be really rough for them. But they'll recover quickly. They're kids, and they'll want to get better. And then they kind of drop that like ego about being the smartest person in the room, and they just start wanting to get better. And I think it's much better to go through that at like age 7 or 8 than it is like at 23 or 24 or whenever when you enter
and so many of the things that we were doing before, things like Boy Scouts and working on the farm, that it kind of happened as a function. Well, Chrisman Frank, I could go on and on. This was a really interesting conversation, and I'm glad to see this very different kind of thinking about education. You have a lot of the classic understanding, but also some new ideas too. So if people wanted to learn more about Synthesis School or follow you, how would they go about doing that?
Just go to synthesis.is is our website. And then I'm on Twitter at Chrisman Frank.
Well, thanks, man, for coming on. I'd love to check in with you in a few months or a year to find out how things are going.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was fun. Talk soon.